Season 1, Episode 2, From Lines in the Gravel. Introduction. I can relate almost anything in life to the Andy Griffith Show. I have been hooked on the show for most of my adult life. I can't tell you the number of times I have responded to a statement or a story with, "Well, that reminds me of an episode of the Andy Griffith Show." In considering why I wanted to write Lines in the Gravel, I remembered Ed Sawyer. He was the main character in the Stranger in Town episode of the Andy Griffith Show. He arrived by bus in Mayberry, unknown to anyone in town. However, he knew intimate details about everyone and called them by name as if he had known them his entire life. He even knew that the ever-awake telephone operator, Sarah, liked to take a pinch of snuff once in a while. One lady thought Ed was from the supernatural world. Barney was convinced that he was a foreign spy, perhaps sent to steal their recipe for marmalade jam or gooseberry pie, and was ready to run Ed Sawyer out of town. Ed was ready to buy George Sepley's gas station, not Wally's filling station, the only gas station ever mentioned on any other episode, but his familiarity with the townsfolk scared old George out of selling to him. Lucy Matthews, the girl Ed was in love with before actually meeting her, was also, rightfully, spooked by him. Eventually, Andy discovered that Ed had grown up moving all around the country, not really having any roots. His buddy in the Army was from Mayberry, and Ed loved hearing about the town and its people. He even began to subscribe to the town's paper. He so longed for a hometown that he decided to make Mayberry his hometown. He even began to believe that he was from Mayberry and was now making the move to his hometown. In the end, the townspeople warmly received Ed as one of their own, though in typical Andy Griffith Show style, he never appeared in another episode. What about you? Do you identify more with Ed Sawyer or with one of the locals from Mayberry? As you recall your own childhood, is there a hometown, a home place that comes to mind? Or were you, like Ed, a wanderer with no real place to call home? I remember as a kid riding with my parents through downtown Jackson, Mississippi, where my parents would point out where their first home used to be. It was a dry cleaner's by then. The four of us kids used to joke about mom and dad's living in a dry cleaner's. My parents moved into a new home in Star, Mississippi when I was born in 1966. All these years later, they still live there. The carport is now a den, other rooms have been added, and quite a few outbuildings have been built, but they are still there. Dad once suggested throwing a roof over the whole 28 acres and being done with it. So when people ask where I'm from, I tell them I'm from Star, Mississippi. Sure, I've lived in other places all over the great state of Mississippi since then, but I'm from only one place, Star, Mississippi. Being able to go back to your childhood home brings a certain stability to life, one that I know not everyone enjoys. Not even most people, I have discovered. I have lived in more than a dozen places since I left home, but I can still go back to where I came from, and I do. And then there's Chris. I thought about him recently. I have actually thought about Chris often through the years, though I never got to know him well. He was a smallish ninth grade dynamo in an English class I taught about 20 years ago. He couldn't sit still or stay on task or keep his mouth closed for more than a few minutes at a time. On the first day of school, after getting the particulars of class requirements and expectations out of the way, I would give my students a chance to ask me a few personal questions. I knew that I would get these questions later in an attempt to interrupt the educational process, so on this first day, I attempted to nip that in the bud. The typical questions were predictable. Are you married? Do you have kids? Where are you from? Followed by, did you know Faith Hill? Where did you go to college? How old are you? Questions like that. Chris raised his hand as soon as I gave his class the opportunity for questions. He was sitting right in front of my desk, and I could already tell that he was the type of student who would simply not be ignored, so I called on him first. His question, "Coach, did your daddy ever whoop you with a stanchion cord?" That question continues to haunt me all these years later. I know enough now to know that Chris wasn't just a hyperactive kid trying to get attention with a shocking question, though he certainly accomplished that. I wonder what it was in Chris's life that had precipitated that question. I wonder why Chris walked in my classroom and voluntarily sat right in front of my desk. Actually, I'm pretty sure that he was seeking attention and affirmation that I must confess I fell short in giving him. I wonder if I could have made a difference in Chris's life had I not been so naive about the different backgrounds from which my students came. I wonder where Chris is now and what he's doing. I wonder how roots, stability, and a place to call home would have changed Chris's life. I am left to wonder because I never dug deeper into his life back then, and I've never seen him since the end of that school year. In the strangest sort of way, remembering Chris reminds me of an episode of the Andy Griffith Show. I hope that Chris found his hometown. My sheltered small-town life has intersected with many different lives since Chris's curious question. 13 years as a teacher and coach and 8 more as a small groups pastor have opened my eyes to the places from which others have come, and not just their geographical locations. I've heard the circumstances and situations of others and stepped into their lives to get to know them and understand them, and even, feebly at times, to try to help them. I have learned that I do have something to offer people who come from different backgrounds and circumstances than I do. I can offer normal. Normal is difficult to define and is even more elusive. Nobody's life is normal, really, but my sisters and brother and I have come to understand that our childhood was about as close to it as we have seen. Further, I would go past normal to describe our home as healthy, and that lays on us a burden of responsibility. When I share my family stories with others whose homes were nothing like the one of my childhood, and neither are their current homes in most instances, many of them have no hopes of familial health. Others, though, do see a glimmer of hope. They see that while creating a healthy family environment is not easy, it is possible. Someone has achieved it. Someone has been there. For those of us who have achieved some measure of health in our families, we have the responsibility to tell our stories, to bring hope to others. I tell the Ainsworth family story in this book, not simply to preserve our favorite stories, and not to present our family as some sort of ideal, but to attempt to preserve the values that those stories reflect. I call this value storying. My hope for this book is to begin to create a blueprint by which families, and by extension, churches, teams, schools, businesses, and other organizations can perpetuate their values by the stories they tell and retell. So sit back and enjoy Lines in the Gravel, the stories of our clan that we often tell when we gather as a family. In the back of your mind, though, make mental and perhaps physical notes of the stories that you should be preserving and or creating. Let's preserve our stories and our values by telling the right stories often. Who knows, maybe our version of normal will not only strengthen our own families, but it may also rub off on a kid like Chris and give him a sense of hometown.